The blood didn't smell like iron. It smelled like peppermint. I was kneeling in my grandfather's foyer, my drafting tube slick with the groundskeeper's sweat, watching my cousin Mark calmly step over my broken ribs. Mark didn't help me up. He just reached into my jacket, took the black ledger that proved he'd murdered our grandfather, and smiled. He told me I had exactly 62 minutes before my name replaced the old man's in the family's balance book. That's when my phone vibrated. It wasn't a text. It was a digital countdown clock. And it was synced to a live video of my 6-year-old daughter sleeping in her bed 3,000 miles away. A man I didn't recognize was standing over her with a syringe. My family didn't just want my silence. They wanted a blood payment for $1 billion debt, and they'd already forged my suicide note. I had 1 hour to either die or watch my daughter do it for me. Let me take you back to where this began. The tires of the old pickup truck crunched over the gravel driveway of the Sterling estate, a sound like grinding teeth that vibrated through Elias Sterling's boots. He cut the engine, and the silence of the Greenwich woods rushed in, heavy and damp. Before him stood the manor, a sprawling Victorian monolith of dark stone and ivy that looked less like a home and more like a tomb. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the skin stretched tight over his calloused hands. In the passenger seat sat the balance book, its leather cover cracked and smelling of old dust and dried ink. He had spent 3 days in a flickering motel room outside Chicago, tracing the jagged handwriting of his ancestors, and what he had found made the bile rise in his throat. His grandfather, Arthur, hadn't died of a stroke. The ledger didn't list medical causes. It listed transactions, a life for a merger, a soul for a spike in the Dow Jones. Elias climbed out of the truck, his boots hitting the ground with a rhythmic thud. 1, 2, 3. He counted the steps toward the massive oak doors, the numbers providing a thin shield against the crushing weight of the house. 4, 5, 6. The air tasted of wet slate and impending snow. As he reached the brass knocker, shaped like a roaring lion, he felt the gaze of a dozen hidden eyes. He didn't wait. He hammered the metal against the wood, the sound echoing through the hollow ribs of the mansion. He wasn't here as a son or nephew. He was here as a witness to a century of murder, demanding the truth before the winter solstice sun could set on his own life. The door creaked open, not to a servant, but to Mark Sterling. His cousin looked as if he had been carved from a block of expensive soap, pale, soft, and smelling of sandalwood. He wore a cashmere sweater that cost more than Elias's truck, and his smile was a masterpiece of manufactured warmth. "Elias," Mark said, his voice a smooth silk ribbon. "We were beginning to think you'd forgotten the way home. We've missed you, truly." Elias didn't move. He held the balance book against his chest, the weight of it pressing into his ribs. "The hospitality can wait, Mark. I've seen the ledger. I know about the 1776 debt, and I know what happened to Arthur." Mark's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered toward the book. "We should discuss this inside, Elias. The wind is picking up, and we wouldn't want you catching a chill. Come, let's get you a drink, a nice scotch, something to take the edge off the road." He stepped back, gesturing into the grand foyer, where a fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast a stag. The warmth was an invitation, a golden glow that promised safety. But Elias saw the way the shadows stretched long and thin across the marble floor. He stepped inside, his boots tracking mud onto the polished stone. 7, 8, 9. The door clicked shut behind him, a sound as final as a casket lid. Mark led him toward the library, talking incessantly about the family's recent successes, his voice a drone that Elias tried to tune out. They passed through the garden gallery, where the scent of lilies was thick enough to choke on. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the greenery. The groundskeeper, a man named Cook, with a face like a bruised plum, lunged from behind a marble bust. There was no warning, no shout, just the rush of air and the heavy scent of damp earth. Elias felt a massive hand clamp onto his shoulder, spinning him around. He stumbled, his boots sliding on the slick floor. Cook was a wall of muscle, his fingers digging into Elias's collarbone like iron hooks. Elias didn't panic. He had spent a decade lifting timber and swinging sledges. He reached into his side pocket and pulled out his heavy steel drafting tube, a solid cylinder of reinforced metal. As Cook pulled back a fist the size of a mallet, Elias swung the tube in a short, brutal arc. The metal connected with Cook's ribs with a sickening crack. The big man gasped, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Elias didn't give him a second chance. He drove the end of the tube into Cook's solar plexus, then brought it down across the man's temple. Cook hit the floor like a felled oak, his head bouncing once against the stone. Elias stood over him, chest heaving, the scent of his own sweat sharp in his nostrils. He reached down and ripped a heavy ring of universal gate keys from the man's belt. They felt cold and jagged in his palm. He turned to Mark, expecting shock or a call for help. Instead, Mark was standing 10 feet away, calmly adjusting his platinum watch. He didn't look at the unconscious man on the floor. He looked at the balance book, which had fallen during the struggle. "You always were the fighter, Elias," Mark said, his voice devoid of its earlier warmth. He stepped forward and picked up the ledger with a reverent touch. "But you're an architect. You should know that a building is only as strong as its foundation, and your foundation is already gone." Elias wiped a smear of Cook's blood from his cheek. "I'm leaving, Mark, and I'm taking that book to the authorities. The debt ends today." Mark let out a short, dry laugh. He flipped the book open to the final page, where a fresh line of ink glistened. "We've already taken care of the paperwork, Elias. Look at the signature." Elias leaned in, his heart stuttering. There, at the bottom of the page, was his own name. The handwriting was perfect. The slight tilt of the S, the sharp tail on the G. It was a masterpiece of forgery, a legal and occult binding that he had never signed. "We needed a name to settle the Solstice account," Mark whispered, his eyes gleaming with a frantic, desperate light. "The family is a firm, Elias, and the firm requires a sacrifice. You aren't a guest, you're the payment." The realization hit Elias like a physical blow, a cold wave that turned his blood to slush. He backed away, his hand fumbling for the keys in his pocket. He turned and bolted for the front door, his boots thundering against the marble. 10, 11, 12. He burst through the entrance and ran into the freezing night, his lungs burning. He reached his truck, fumbling with the door handle. It swung open, but when he turned the key, there was only a hollow, metallic click. He popped the hood, his fingers trembling. The engine block was a ruin of shattered metal and severed wires, cracked open as if by a giant's hammer. He looked toward the massive iron perimeter gates, 300 yards down the drive. They were shut tight, the electronic locks glowing with a steady, mocking red light. He was caged. The woods around the estate felt like a wall of spears, the Douglas firs swaying in the wind like mourners. He was trapped in the very structure he had come to dismantle. A flicker of movement on the second-floor balcony caught his eye. Aunt Catherine stood there, her silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to pull the skin from her face. She looked down at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a moth in a jar. "Don't bother with the gates, Elias," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the crisp air. "The local sheriff is a Sterling by marriage, and the deputy's pensions are tied to our stock portfolio. We've already filed the report. You've been missing for 3 days, dear. A tragic case of exhaustion. They'll find your truck in the ravine tomorrow morning." Elias felt the world tilt. He was a ghost before he was even dead. He looked at his phone, hoping for a signal, even a bar of roaming data. The screen flickered to life, but there was no home screen. Instead, a black background displayed a single set of glowing red numbers. 02-1459, 02-1458. The countdown had begun. It wasn't just a clock. It was a rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate in the very air. He looked toward the manor, and his breath hitched. Every window was dark, but he could hear a sound, a synchronized, mechanical ticking. In the library, the foyer, the kitchen, every clock in the house had stopped at the same moment, their gears frozen as the digital timer on his phone marched toward 0. The ritual wasn't a suggestion. It was a physical law of the estate. He retreated toward the back of the house, seeking a way into the servants' entrance. He needed a landline, a way to scream into the world before the silence swallowed him. He slipped into the industrial kitchen, the air smelling of cold grease and rosemary. The stainless steel counters gleamed like surgical tools in the moonlight. Suddenly, a shadow moved by the walk-in freezer. Thomas Ward, the family's legal fixer, stepped into the light. He didn't carry a gun. He carried a length of piano wire wrapped around 2 wooden handles. His face was a mask of granite, his eyes empty of everything but the task at hand. "The contract is very specific, Elias," Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The blood must be harvested within the walls. It has to be clean, no mess for the auditors." He lunged. Thomas was fast, moving with the practiced grace of a predator. He whipped the wire toward Elias's throat. Elias ducked, the wire whistling inches above his head and slicing through a hanging copper pot. He scrambled backward, his hand hitting the lever of the industrial fire suppression system. He yanked it. With a deafening roar, a cloud of thick white chemical foam erupted from the ceiling. It was a blizzard of pressurized powder, filling the room in seconds. Thomas disappeared into the white fog, coughing and cursing as the foam stung his eyes and lungs. Elias didn't wait to see if he stayed down. He felt his way along the wall, his fingers brushing against cold tile, until he found the small wooden door of the servants' stairs. He dove inside, the sound of his own heart a frantic drum in his ears. 13, 14, 15. He climbed into the dark, narrow veins of the house, the chemical smell of the foam clinging to his clothes. He descended into the cellar, hoping to find a way out through the old coal chutes. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and fermented grapes. He moved through the wine cellar, his flashlight beam dancing over dusty bottles of Bordeaux and port. At the far end, behind a rack of vintage champagne, he noticed a seam in the masonry. His architect's eyes saw the flaw, a hairline fracture in the mortar that didn't match the rest of the wall. He pushed. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden room no larger than a closet. Inside, there were no altars, no candles, no goat skulls. Instead, there were rows of glass vials, each labeled with a name and a date. Arthur Sterling, 2014. Julian Sterling, 1998. Subverted. Phase 1. Build hope. Elias reached out, his fingers trembling as he picked up a vial. He expected to find a curse, but his nose caught a faint, bitter scent. The sharp, clinical tang of synthetic alkaloids. Relief flooded him, a sudden, dizzying heat. It wasn't magic. It wasn't some ancient, unstoppable demonic force demanding blood. It was chemistry. They were poisoners. The accidents, the sacrifices. They were all just well-timed doses of military-grade neurotoxins that mimicked heart failure or strokes. This was something he could fight. If it was just a conspiracy of men and molecules, he could expose it. He could take a vial, get to a lab, and tear the Sterling legacy down with a toxicology report. He felt a surge of competence. He was a man of science, of wood and steel, and he had finally found the mechanical heart of the lie. Phase 2. False positive. He tucked 3 of the vials into his heavy coat pocket, his mind already racing through the steps of his escape. He would find a way to the main road, hitch a ride to the city, and go straight to the feds. He pictured the look on Catherine's face when the FBI swarmed the estate. He felt a grim smile touch his lips. The blood debt was just a clever brand for murder. He turned to leave the hidden room, his steps lighter than they had been all night. He had the truth. He had the evidence. The nightmare was losing its teeth. Phase 3. The crack. He stopped at the edge of the wine cellar. Something was wrong. He looked at the labels again, his brow furrowing. Underneath the names and dates, there was a secondary line of text in tiny, precise print. It wasn't a dosage or a chemical formula. It was a series of coordinates and a list of affected heirs. He looked at the vial for Arthur Sterling. Below his name, it listed Elias Sterling, primary recipient. He felt a cold prickle dance across his skin. Why would his name be on a vial from 10 years ago? Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. The truth hit him with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. He looked at his own hands in the flashlight beam. They were steady, but the skin around his fingernails was tinged with a faint, bruised purple. He remembered the scotch Mark had offered. He remembered the hospitality. But then he remembered the water in Oregon, the lucky socks Jennifer gave him, the meals he'd eaten for years. This wasn't a one-time dose. The Sterlings hadn't just poisoned the wine tonight. They had been dosing him for a decade. The toxins were already in his marrow, his fat cells, his brain. They were slow-acting, dormant agents that required a specific trigger to become lethal. He wasn't just being hunted. He was a walking time bomb. The countdown on his phone wasn't just a ritualistic timer. It was the activation window for the final dose he'd inhaled in the fire suppression foam or the drink in the foyer. He stumbled against the wine rack, a bottle of 1945 Petrus shattering at his feet. The purple stain on his hands was spreading. He realized with a sickening horror that even if he escaped the grounds, he was already dead. The family didn't need to kill him. They just had to wait for the clock to run out. The evidence in his pocket was his own death warrant, and there was no hospital in the world that could scrub his blood clean in 2 hours. He was trapped inside his own body, a prisoner of a chemistry he couldn't outrun. He forced himself to move, his legs feeling heavy, as if he were wading through deep water. He had to get to the mechanical room. If he was going to die, he wouldn't do it quietly. He climbed back into the walls, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Above him, he heard the heavy thud of boots. Mark and Thomas were moving through the house, their voices muffled by the floorboards. "We have the thermal sweep running," Mark said, his voice tight with an artificial urgency. "He's in the lower levels. We need to flush him out before the activation window closes. We can't have him dying in a crawl space. The cleanup is a nightmare. A nightmare." Elias pressed his back against a cold copper pipe. He watched the red numbers on his phone. 014212. He moved through the darkness, guided by the memory of the blueprints he had studied as a child. He found a ventilation duct and pulled himself inside, the metal groaning under his weight. He crawled toward the central mechanical room, the heart of the estate's power and security. He reached a grate overlooking the room. It was a forest of pipes, boilers, and humming electrical panels. He kicked the grate open and dropped to the floor. 16, 17, 18. He ignored the ache in his shoulder and lunged for the main security console. It was a massive slab of glass and steel, glowing with the status of every lock and camera on the property. He didn't try to hack it. He didn't have the time. He grabbed a heavy pipe wrench from a nearby workbench and smashed the plexiglass cover. He reached inside, grabbing a handful of high-voltage wires. "Measure twice," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Trust never." He slammed the wires together. A brilliant blue arc of electricity erupted, the smell of ozone filling the room. The lights in the manor flickered and died. Throughout the house, the sound of magnetic locks disengaging echoed like a series of gunshots. The perimeter gates groaned, their motors straining as the emergency override forced them to cycle open. He had his window. He bolted for the service exit, bursting out into the snow. The cold air hit his face, sharp and biting. He ran toward the edge of the woods, his boots sinking into the white drifts. 19, 20, 21. He was 50 yards from the property line when a flash of light erupted from the darkness. A bullet tore through the air, grazing his shoulder. Elias spun, the impact throwing him into the snow. He looked back and saw Aunt Catherine standing by the stone gatepost. She held a small, elegant pistol in her hand, her face as cold as the frost on the trees. "You were always the most difficult piece on the board, Elias," she said, stepping toward him. Elias didn't wait for her to fire again. He lunged from the ground, his weight carrying them both into a drift. They struggled in the snow, Catherine fighting with a wiry, desperate strength. Elias managed to grab her wrist, twisting the gun away. He pinned her down, the pistol pressed against her temple. He looked into her eyes, looking for a shred of the woman who had once read him stories. There was nothing but ice. He roared in frustration and threw the gun into the woods. He couldn't do it. He couldn't be the monster they wanted him to be. He turned and began to run, his breath coming in jagged, purple-tinged sobs. "Elias, stop!" The voice was Mark's. He was standing by the open gates, holding a tablet. The screen was bright in the darkness. Elias stopped, his heart freezing in his chest. On the screen, he saw a small, windowless room. In the corner, huddled on an unmade bed, was a girl with messy blonde hair and large, terrified eyes. "Samantha," Elias whispered. "We picked her up from her school in Seattle yesterday," Mark said, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and triumph. "She's a lovely girl, Elias. She keeps apologizing to the walls. We have her in a transport van just outside the guest house. If you don't complete the cycle, if you don't walk into that house and settle the debt, we'll put her name on the next page. We'll make her the primary recipient." Elias looked at the red numbers on his phone. 001522. The world seemed to shrink until there was nothing but the glowing screen and the sound of his daughter's muffled cries. The Sterlings didn't just want his life. They wanted his submission. They wanted him to walk into his own grave to save the one thing he had left. "The guest house is already prepared," Catherine said, standing up and brushing the snow from her coat. "The gas is silent, Elias. You'll just go to sleep. It's a staged suicide. A tragic end for a man who lost his mind. Your daughter goes home. She gets the trust fund. She lives a long, quiet life. All you have to do is walk through the door." Elias looked at the guest house, a small stone cottage 50 yards away. It looked peaceful, nestled under a canopy of snow-heavy oaks. He looked at the gates, then back at the tablet. He had no choice. "Let her go," Elias said, his voice dead. "Once you're inside," Mark promised, "we have the van keys right here." Elias began to walk. 1, 2, 3. He didn't count for safety anymore. He counted the seconds of his life leaking away. He reached the guest house door. It was heavy oak, beautiful and solid. He turned the handle and stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him, the magnetic lock engaging with a heavy thud. He was alone in the dark. The air smelled of almonds, the telltale scent of the triggering agent. He looked around the room. It was furnished like a luxury hotel, but he saw the vents in the ceiling, the reinforced glass in the windows. It was a high-tech execution chamber. But Elias was an architect. He didn't see a room. He saw a system. He looked at the HVAC vent. He looked at the universal gate keys still in his pocket. He remembered the blueprints of the guest house, the way the ventilation was tied directly into the main manor's library to share the heating load during the winter. He didn't sit down to die. He pulled a chair to the vent and began to unscrew the grate with the edge of a key. Outside, Mark and Catherine stood by the van, watching the guest house through the thermal feed on the tablet. "It's done," Mark said, his voice shaky. We should call Miller. Let him know the debt is settled. "In a moment," Catherine said, her eyes fixed on the house. "I want to see the heat signature fade. I want to be sure the dirt is gone." Inside the house, Elias had the vent open. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the balance book, which he had snatched back from the library during his escape. He pulled a lighter from the mantel, a silver Sterling heirloom, and held it to the pages. The old paper caught instantly, the names of his murdered ancestors curling into black ash. He shoved the burning book into the intake vent. Then he used the gate keys to jam the mechanical dampers open. He knew the pressure differential between the guest house and the manor would act like a chimney. The fire wouldn't stay here. It would be sucked through the ductwork, fueled by the very gas they were using to kill him. He dove for the floor as a low whoosh echoed through the vents. In the manor library, Mark and Catherine were startled by a sudden roar. A wall of flame erupted from the fireplace and the wall vents, fueled by the pressurized gas and the burning ledger. The ancient books, the heavy drapes, the oak paneling, it all went up in seconds. Elias kicked out the reinforced window of the guest house with a frantic, desperate strength. He tumbled into the snow, gasping for clean air. He didn't look back at the burning manor. He ran for the van. He found the driver, a man he didn't recognize, and slammed the heavy steel keys into the man's temple before he could draw a weapon. He ripped the back door open. "Samantha!" The girl lunged into his arms, sobbing. Elias held her, the smell of smoke and ozone clinging to his skin. He looked toward the manor. The library was a roaring furnace, the flames licking at the stone walls. He saw Mark and Catherine silhouetted against the fire, trapped behind the heavy security glass they had installed to keep the world out. He didn't feel joy. He felt a cold, hollow peace. He put Samantha in the passenger seat of the van and drove. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the estate, where a black sedan was parked in the middle of the road. Richard Miller stood by the car, his antique pocket watch in his hand. He looked at the burning manor on the hill with the detached boredom of a man watching a movie he'd seen 100 times. Subverted Phase 1. Build hope. Elias slammed the van into park and stepped out. the vials of toxins clutched in his hand. He marched toward Miller, his jaw set. "It's over, Miller. The book is ash. The family's burning. I have the evidence of the poisoning right here. You're the lawyer. You're going to help me turn this over to the federal authorities. You've been with the family for 40 years. You know where the bodies are buried. We can end this tonight. You can walk away clean if you help me dismantle the rest of the estate." Elias felt a surge of hope. Miller was a professional, a man of law. He wasn't a Sterling. He was the one person who could navigate the legal wreckage and ensure Samantha was safe forever. Phase 2. False positive. Miller looked at the vials, then back at Elias. He gave a slow, measured nod. "You've done the impossible, Elias. You've broken the cycle. The Sterlings were always prone to excess. They lost sight of the ledger's true purpose." He reached out and took the vials, tucking them into his vest pocket. "I have a contact at the Justice Department. We'll go together. Your daughter will be placed under federal protection within the hour. You've won, son. You've actually won." He put a hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture that felt remarkably like a father's blessing. Phase 3. The crack. Elias began to relax, his shoulders dropping for the first time in days. But then he heard a sound, a faint, rhythmic scratching. He looked down at Miller's other hand. The lawyer was holding a fountain pen, scribbling something on a small slip of paper. He wasn't writing a note of distress or a contact name. He was recording the exact time, 11:58 p.m. Elias frowned. "What are you doing? We need to move." He looked at Miller's eyes. They weren't the eyes of a 70-year-old man. They were ancient, deep, and utterly devoid of human warmth. Phase 4. Catastrophic reveal. "I'm recording the closing of the account," Miller whispered. The air around the sedan suddenly grew heavy, the smell of ozone replaced by a scent like sun-scorched parchment and old blood. Miller didn't look at the fire on the hill with regret. He looked at it with the satisfaction of a farmer clearing a field. "You think this started in 1776 with a contract?" Miller laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave. "I am the contract, Elias. I didn't join the Sterlings 40 years ago. I founded them. I've watched 6 generations of your family burn themselves out to keep me fed. The toxins were just a modern convenience, a way to keep the line tidy. But the debt is older than chemistry." He held up the slip of paper. It was glowing with a faint, sickly light. Elias realized with a jolt of pure terror that the legal foundation he thought he was destroying wasn't a book at all. It was the man standing in front of him. Miller wasn't the employee. He was the beneficiary. "You burned the ledger," Miller said, stepping closer. "Which means the debt is now unsecured. And when a debt is unsecured, I don't just take the interest, I take the collateral." He looked at Samantha in the van. Elias lunged, but his limbs suddenly refused to move. The toxins in his blood, the activation window. It wasn't just chemistry. It was a physical manifestation of the debt. Miller hadn't just watched the Sterlings, he had shaped their very biology. "But," Miller said, pausing as he looked at the burning manor, "the Sterling name is now tarnished. The brand is dead, and I hate a messy ledger." He looked at Elias, a cold, predatory smile stretching his thin lips. "You rejected the power. You chose the girl. That creates a fascinating legal paradox. If I take her, the line ends. If the line ends, the debt can never be repaid." He tapped his chin with the fountain pen. "I think I'll let you go, Elias. Not out of mercy, But because a penniless, broken father looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life is a much more interesting form of interest than a quick death. He stepped back into his car. The Sterling fortune is gone. The accounts are frozen. The properties will be seized by the state by morning. You are a man with no name, no money, and a daughter who will never sleep through the night again. Consider the debt. Paused. The sedan pulled away into the snowy dark, leaving Elias standing in the middle of the road. He stood there for a long time, the heat from the burning manor on the hill the only thing keeping him from freezing. He looked at his hands. The purple tint was fading, but he knew it would never truly be gone. He was a ruin of a man, a bankrupt architect of a shattered life. He walked back to the van and climbed inside. Samantha was staring at the fire, her small hands gripped together. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Are we going home?" Elias looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't count the steps. He didn't think about the foundation or the grain of the wood. He reached over and tucked a lock of hair behind her ear. "No, Sam," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "We're going to find a new place, somewhere quiet." He drove away from the Sterling estate, the glow of the fire fading in the rearview mirror. He had lost his career, his family, and his future. He was a ghost in a world that only valued the living. 3 years later, the sound of a plane hitting a cedar plank echoed through the Oregon woods. It was a rhythmic, soothing sound, the thud of steel on wood. Elias Sterling stood at his workbench, the scent of fresh sawdust filling his lungs. His hands were scarred and stained with resin, the calluses thick enough to dull the sting of a splinter. He was building a dining table, solid oak with mortise and tenon joints that would last a century. He didn't live in a manor. He lived in a small cabin he'd built with his own hands, tucked into a valley where the Douglas firs grew so thick the sun only reached the ground for a few hours a day. He didn't have a bank account or a platinum watch. He had a jar of cash under the floorboards and a reputation as the best carpenter in the county. He heard the sound of the front door opening. 1, 2, 3. Samantha walked into the workshop, carrying 2 mugs of steaming cocoa. She was taller now, her eyes brighter, though she still had a habit of apologizing to the doorframe when she bumped into it. "The sunset is starting, Dad," she said, handing him a mug. Elias took it, the warmth of the ceramic seeping into his tired fingers. He stepped out onto the porch, the air smelling of pine and wood smoke. The sky was a bruised purple, the same color his hands had been on that long-ago night in Greenwich. He looked at the woods, at the shadows stretching between the trees. He knew that somewhere, in a high-rise office or a hidden archive, Richard Miller was still scratching his pen across a slip of paper. He knew the debt wasn't gone, it was just waiting. But as he watched his daughter sit on the porch swing, humming a tune she'd made up herself, he realized that integrity wasn't built into the blueprints. It was built in the moments between the breaths. He wasn't a Sterling anymore. He was just a man who knew how to build things that stayed upright in a storm. He sat down beside her, the wood of the porch creaking under his weight. A solid, honest sound. The blood debt was canceled, not by fire or law, but by the simple act of choosing to be a father instead of a legacy. He took a sip of the cocoa and watched the sun dip below the horizon, finally at peace with the silence. The end.